Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Codology, and if you are new here, welcome. If you are a returning subscriber, then welcome, and I would just like to thank you so much for subscribing and for watching. But without any further ado, let's get into this video because I have quite a lot that I would like to speak about. Fictional villains are sort of seeing this rise in popularity, this sudden interest in their origin stories, in what made them who they are. We seem to love these fictional villains and sort of giving them the much deserved, in my opinion, credit and depth which they are perfectly well entitled to. And I actually think it's interesting to see why and when fictional villains became such a thing. Why and when did we start liking fictional villains? In my opinion, our interest in and liking of fictional villains started with a film which I don't necessarily think many people in fact see as being a starting point, but I think that this was quite pivotal, and that was The Devil Wears Prada. The Devil Wears Prada was quite exceptional, particularly because of Meryl Streep's absolutely stellar interpretation and portrayal of super villain, fashionista and runway magazine editor, just everything that anybody could dream of being. I think Anna Wintour would want to be Miranda Priestly. Miranda Priestly was everything. I mean, you still see memes of Miranda Priestly. It's still an absolutely iconic film. I didn't even necessarily understand it as a child. I was a child when it came out. I could understand how cold, how misunderstood, how multi-dimensional, how powerful, most importantly, Miranda was. And that was something that I was absolutely struck by. I think what The Devil Wears Prada was able to very effectively and very convincingly show was that Miranda Priestly had an origin story. There was a reason explaining and justifying why she was the way that she was. She was also seen not necessarily as this perfect individual that she presented herself as.
I don't really care what anybody writes about me. But my girls, it's just so unfair to the girls.
And it was pretty exceptional seeing somebody as a workaholic, complete tyrant, as somebody that you could actually garner sympathy for. I took a BuzzFeed quiz, basically looking at who was the bigger villain between Miranda Priestly and Andy's boyfriend Nate. You know, Nate, the very sweet, dewy-eyed cook or chef, and Andy's friends. Yeah, her friends who like take her phone and she can't answer Miranda. Yes. It seems to be a general consensus now that he is the actual villain in The Devil Wears Prada and not Miranda, which is very interesting, very interesting. And I have read numerous opinion pieces and comments about people claiming that in fact Nate and Andy's friends are the real villains. They are the horrible people that nobody likes. So I think that says it all. Even though Mean Girls came out before The Devil Wears Prada, I feel that because of the depth and complexity which The Devil Wears Prada gave to cinematic villains, that our love for Mean Girls has sort of moved and evolved into a love for Regina George. I don't feel that people are as critical, or that audiences, particularly sort of cult followers of Mean Girls, are as judgmental in a negative way of Regina George as we were when it first came out or when we first watched it as young teenagers. Whereas now she is sort of just an icon. Mean Girls has been incredibly successful. Regina George is an example of the villain par excellence of the teen rom-com. She is feisty, she is absolutely plastic in every sense of the word. She is fake, she is unfaithful, she is completely selfish, two-faced, everything that in the real world we absolutely despise. And I feel that us liking Regina George stems from the situation which we can see her being in, which is a very, very judgmental, harsh, confusing and animalistic environment, which is high school. And because of that, her actions and how she is makes sense. And I think, for instance, High School Musical did sort of the same thing with Sharpay Evans, but I mean, it was far more, you know, happy-go-lucky. I think Mean Girls was very raw in that sense. And I feel that that is why people are far more sympathetic toward Regina George and far more willing to actually like her and see her as pivotal to the story relative to, say, merely looking at Caddy Heron. There's that incredibly memorable scene where Regina's vest is sabotaged by Janice and Caddy, and she just walks out of that changing room with so much confidence, with absolutely no deterrence whatsoever to her sense of self-worth, and everybody else adopts it and she starts a new trend. It didn't matter that it was ugly, that it was unintentional, that it was just the most bizarre thing ever. Regina made it work and everybody followed suit because she literally was just fine with it. It was what it was. She was a trendsetter, and that is incredibly appealing. In all these films, villains are given the best songs. Villains are given the likes of Let It Go, Ursula in The Little Mermaid, Poor Unfortunate Souls. All the songs that villains are given are pretty memorable and are just the best songs. They're the songs with the most oomph about them. More vocals, far more memorable, far more dramatic, melodramatic. Just a whole sort of aura of sensationalism and the macabre about them is just very, very appealing, and not just to like sort of outlandish audiences, but just in general. Everybody sort of likes and knows their songs, and Let It Go is definitely an example of that. So Let It Go was a villain song, but it has taken on a life entirely of its own. Reading the lyrics or just listening to the song, it's quite clear that it is about finding yourself and accepting the worth and the power that you have, and sort of just letting it go. Literally taking your life into your own hands, taking your own destiny and making of it what you will of yourself and of it. An article about the song in Time magazine actually describes it as being the ultimate LGBTQ+ anthem and a feminist anthem, and it has sort of these tones and undercurrents of accepting yourself, accepting your power and your worth and going with it and embracing it and just being. It's about becoming the hero of your own life, and falls very much into this narrative now that we keep hearing about being the main character and how you are the main character of your life or your situation or your story, and sort of that entire ambiance is very much, I think, sort of deriving from things such as these stories that we see in films and in series about these very nuanced characters, how they've actually just taken their imperfections and made it into a real part of themselves that sort of defines their character and their uniqueness, which is very interesting. And there have been so many villain fictional stories that have done so well purely because they have fed into this idea of the villain as nuanced, and the villain as multidimensional, and the villain as having an origin story which justifies why they are the complete wreck that they are now, and why they do what they do, and why in fact sometimes even the bad things that they do are actually not bad. We have, for instance, Maleficent and its sequel as well, which I haven't yet watched. There's Wicked, which is an amazing musical, and again, the music of villains is just, I mean, the example of how brilliant it is Wicked, basically about the Wicked Witch of the West from the original Wizard of Oz. Then we've got Birds of Prey, all about Harley Quinn and her origin story, which has just spawned so many trends. The roller skating trend definitely can pay some tribute to being reborn via Harley Quinn and obviously the pandemic and what have you, but like definitely Birds of Prey definitely brought that back into the foe. Villains have to have quirks, and these quirks make them distinguishable. They make them sort of not like other villains, actually. Every villain is very different, is very exceptional in their own way. Ursula has her own quirks. She has her voluptuous bosom. She has that very that very interesting kind of seductive like crawl that she does, which I think is just amazing. Actually, can I do it? Sorry, I just had to do that. In all seriousness, I think that the fictional villain is liked so much now because they are far more relatable to the human condition relative to their counterparts who are good, who are pretty, as a consequence, boring, very conventional, very stereotypical. You sort of can just see them in a blur. I mean, I don't see much distinction between sort of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella. They all sort of have that exact same air about them, which makes them pretty predictable and unexceptional, at least for me, and at least I think relative to their villain, to the person who is making their life hell. What is appealing about the villain is that their flaws are what make them exceptional. Their flaws are what make them so interesting, which make us want to follow why they do what they do and their journey and their actions and how they offset the slow pace of a film or of a series. There's also the unpredictability of the life and the actions of a villain. You can't really tell what they're going to do next. I like to call it the sort of Joker effect, in the sense of Heath Ledger's Joker. Another reason why I think we see the rise of the fictional villain is because most traditional villains were traditionally female, and they were portrayed in a very traditional sense as being old, ugly, hags, witches, social outcasts, completely shunned by society. Them being outside of society, outside of the norm, sort of deviating from everyone and everything, was seen as something that they brought on themselves, that them being the villain was their fault, and them being evil was because they were just inherently evil. Most villains traditionally fit into a very sexist, very ageist notion of a villain. They have no friends, they're antisocial. The only creatures willing to befriend them are the ugliest of the ugliest in the animal kingdom. Eels, snakes, crows. They are obviously all spinsters. Obviously everything is just about them sort of failing as women. I think contemporary politics and also the evolving role of women in society and just economically, the greater economic freedom that women have and how we have sort of just owned that has very much influenced how Hollywood and the film industry has decided to portray women, and particularly how it has decided to portray villains. I think Meryl Streep actually put this very well in describing how in her 40s she suddenly was offered, I think in 1 year, 8 different roles, all of them being witches. That was then in the 80s when Meryl Streep was in her 40s. But now, I mean, it's incredible that actresses such as Meryl Streep are still finding these absolutely amazing roles and making them. Glenn Close, Meryl Streep, Sigourney Weaver, Emma Thompson, Judi Dench, Maggie Smith. There is now a market for older women in Hollywood films and in roles that aren't purely roles that are them portraying witches. And even when they do, ironically, portray a witch, such as Meryl Streep, her witch is actually liberated from being the stereotypical traditional witch and is sort of transformed into her real actual self after she's gotten her powers back, I believe, in Into the Woods. And I think on a less positive note, this just shows that with the film industry, as with anything, what sells is promoted and is taken on board, and this narrative sells in this day and age based on the evolving role of men and women in modern societies relative to 30 odd years ago. Whereas what doesn't sell, which is that very traditional old school image, is abandoned. What underlies all of that is money, really. So is it really as revelatory or as profound and significant as we'd like to think? I don't know. That's a topic for another day. I think one exception to this trend of the likable fictional villain, or a positive audience response to the origin story of a villain, is Joker. By Joker, I mean Joaquin Phoenix's interpretation of Joker relative to Heath Ledger's interpretation of Joker. And I think the audience response to both of them really says a lot about why we are far more drawn to being understanding and empathetic toward fictional villains relative to real life villains. I think Joker is the exception because the Joker is far too close to real life. The villain, firstly, is male, and not just that, he is a white heterosexual male in Gotham or in New York City. And as we all know, in this day and age, white heterosexual men are complete no-nos. They are just instantaneously like on the sidelines. So that doesn't really fit into, I think, the contemporary political narrative of our time. In watching Joker, for me, what it really demonstrated and seemed to portray was the experience of the very disenfranchised white working class communities within modern Western societies, who are often left behind by their white middle to upper class elites and politicians, and are also left behind by the identity politics and multiculturalism of the day, mainly because this white working class is very patriotic, is very traditional, and is also very nostalgic for a particular vision of their experience as being enfranchised. Joker was about mental illness, but particularly about mental illness being a product not of somebody's mental state, but a product of the situation in which they found themselves in. Joker's or Arthur's mental illness and his mental health was definitely impacted, if not originating from, the situation that he found himself in, the constant repetitive rejection, his inability to socialize or to find meaningful connections with people, his desire to create happiness for people and a society which had rejected him and felt nothing for him. His actions and him finding himself and finding his understanding, at least, of sanity was not in medicating himself, but rather in doing what the song Let It Go tells us to do, which is to take control of our own destiny, to embrace the power which we have not yet realized, to not fear it, but to become it. Medication was not the solution to the problem. So in comparison to Joaquin Phoenix's interpretation of Joker, Heath Ledger's interpretation of his Joker in The Dark Knight, produced or released in 2008, was far more loyal to the graphic novels and definitely still had that detachment which didn't make it in any way seem like it was a part of our real life. The Dark Knight was definitely about The Dark Knight, about Batman, and about a villain in the context of a very supernatural world. As I've said, we love the nuances of fictional villains. The amount of Severus Snape fandoms which I have read, the number of videos detailing the origin stories of Severus Snape is just, it blows my mind, it really does. Ministry of Magic, PTA, where you at? However, beyond the glitz, the glam, and the money of the modern Hollywood fictional villain, these are very unforgiving and very critical times for real life villains. I think the most notable example of our modern real life villain is the internet Karen. And this is internet Karen in all her stereotypical glory. She is white, she is entitled, she is mostly American, she is middle-aged. In her eyes, she is the ultimate main character. And what makes her exceptional is that she does not get why nobody else sees her as the main character, and she, as a consequence, tries to coerce everybody into seeing her as the main character of existence. This is, of course, in that instance in which her peacock feathers are completely on full display, and that happens to also be the time when somebody gets out their smartphone, records it all and puts it onto Facebook or onto Twitter, and then this person suddenly has their entire life destroyed because of 40 seconds of footage. In the case of the internet Karen, there is absolutely no room for nuance. There is no room for origin story. There is no room for any explanation surrounding those 40 seconds of footage, which could and oftentimes do potentially ruin the life and prospects of this individual.
A gate attendant at a local park has been fired after a viral video of her screaming at a driver. You may have seen it.
No, I'm not.
Ma'am, hurry, please hurry! Mike! Mike! Mike!
If you had seen it, you probably didn't forget it. This happened a few weeks ago at Cedar Breaks Park near Lake Georgetown. The driver says he made a wrong turn into the park and had to turn around to leave. And that's when the gate attendant called the police and then tried to block him, as you saw there. According to the driver's Facebook post, he left and police pulled him over a few miles away. He says they let him go after he showed them the video. The Army Corps of Engineers, which manages the park, says the worker was fired because it does not condone that kind of behavior.
Villains in real life are only cared about because they have done something socially unacceptable in real life. Because they have done something socially unacceptable, they have obviously deviated from an accepted standard which people in public and in public life are expected to uphold, or they have done something that is morally wrong. People care about them showing atonement and publicly showing that they want to atone for what they have done. But what is systematic with all of these real life villains which we identify in today's age is that it is a never-ending cycle. The villain is identified for some behavior or something that they have done or said. They are then expected to apologize. They then apologize. The apology is not satisfactory, mainly because, well, in my opinion, we don't really know who the apology is for. There is no definitive individual or no definitive group of people, no definitive community. It's sort of just an apology that's put out there publicly for the public, with all its nuances, with all its complexities, with all its different opinions and definitions of things, to judge and determine whether it is genuine or not, whether it's accepted or not. The ambiguity surrounding it just creates a cycle again in which the apology isn't accepted and is not good enough, and this person has to somehow show in the span of leaving social media for a month or two that they have changed and that they have educated themselves and cultivated themselves and become a better person. And most of the time it just is not clear who they are apologizing to. Yet this always is perceived as just good PR, because ultimately what happens is that they are losing deals with companies, with brands and businesses. They are also losing followers, subscribers and views. Their careers could potentially be destroyed, especially if they have careers which they really need a fan base for. A notable example is Gabby Hanna and the recent drama which she surrounded herself in. I think what is also interesting about the rise of the Karen memes is that they sort of represent an easy target. It's easy to vilify and dehumanize them because they are so accessible, and their accessibility is a consequence of our internet age, particularly of social media, providing a platform in which you can literally access everything that you need to know about that person. You can find out about their job, you can directly communicate with their families, with their followers. It seems that their vilification and their dehumanization is justified because of a few minutes of bad choices or pretty poor and disgusting behavior. They are the easy and immediate targets for what are deep and well-rooted serious issues of inequality and injustice, and particularly of anger in modern Western societies. The exclusivity which what we will broadly define as the 1% embody makes them exclusive and very inaccessible. They sort of remind me of old school Hollywood, in which the Golden Globes or the Oscars was just a very exclusive, non-televised luncheon with these Hollywood stars who would only show themselves to the public when they chose to, in very curated interviews or on screen. The super rich are just as inaccessible, and they are not on social media or as dependent on their social media audiences and presence in order to make a living for themselves or to find validation, as a lot of these influencers need. What all of these categories have very much in common is that they represent the few who have benefited largely from the status quo and from the way that our society currently is. They've benefited either financially or circumstantially from being either stereotypically beautiful or good looking, pretty privilege, being of the dominant racial group or the most powerful racial group in a society, or simply becoming famous for being famous. We now no longer see celebrities and influencers in their most perfect and curated style, image and context. We see them as very flawed human beings. We see them as us. But somehow this relatability is not genuine relatability, I would say, because it's shrouded in them having so much influence, having so much clout, having so much money, having so many perks for doing such stupid things. And that makes it difficult because they're like us, but they're also not like us, if that makes any sense. Social media and the invasive scrutiny of these celebrities and personalities has humanized them, but rather than humanization being relatability, it has merely taken away that aura of exceptionality, and in a way a lot of people, I think, feel betrayed by that, because the person behind the image is just that, a very flawed, imperfect, selfish, pretty inconsiderate person like the rest of us. But they've still got that image. That image still exists and they still make money from that image. Socioeconomic inequality is also notably, as I've said, on the rise, as the rich are getting richer for seemingly doing things which this pandemic has made quite evident are not in any way essential to human life. Audiences and fans are rightly becoming more critical, but with this criticism also has come, which I think is less positive, a lot of rage and being very easily enraged by even a minuscule hiccup that said influencer or celebrity may have. I think a good example of all of this is Lea Michele, who played Rachel on Glee. In all of its seasons, she was accused by her fellow co-stars and also by extras of her diva antics and being, quite frankly, a bully toward everyone who she encountered. Basically, the epitome of brunette Regina George. Lea actually deactivated her Twitter account in July of 2020 after a huge backlash over her not publicly expressing her grief over the disappearance of Naya Rivera, her co-star from Glee who played Santana. The online backlash brought up those things which had already been brought up in June of 2020 about her being microaggressive, about her being a bully toward her co-stars, and also accusations of her being racist. She lost brand deals with L'Oreal, with HelloFresh, and was actually called out by them publicly by these businesses who would no longer affiliate and associate themselves with her. So in a sense, even though she's still rich, wealthy, doing great things on Broadway, what have you, living her best life, she's definitely undergone public humiliation for being what I would perceive to be pretty common of every single Hollywood personality who thinks that they are all that and has grown up believing that they are all that. Basically, what I would say is that everything in our real life labeling of villains is not as clearly defined as the comprehensive 2-hour-long feature-length films and sequels of explanation given fictional villains. I think that this is just because of general things, such as us having very short attention spans, our brains very much liking understandable, comprehensible, chronological, lots of ills, but yes, clear-cut, black and white narratives that make sense. But anyway, that's all I really have to say on that. I just found it very interesting how with the release of Cruella recently, how we sort of are very into this trend of villains being given their own sort of origin stories, fictional villains that is, but why we don't extend the same sort of curiosity and, I guess, love to our real life villains that we see. These films and these series show that villains aren't born this way, that they actually become who they eventually are. And we, in the same way, don't find ourselves born as either good or bad people or as reprehensible people who at the core are terrible. We do some pretty stupid things. All of us do. Not all of us have the privilege of having it broadcast to the internet and to particular communities who may very well condone our behavior and our stupid actions and words. But I really would just like to hear your opinion, and well, I'm just so grateful that you are watching. Thank you so much for viewing and for taking the time out of your day to watch this. Also, thank you so much for subscribing, and if you are interested, I would love for you to subscribe and to join this very small family that I am trying to create here. So thank you very much, and I will see you in the next one.